Ho, 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 ho. What it is, YOUTUBE. It's your brother, the MOPOWERZ, where knowledge is power, and we are BACKAGAIN on a terrific Tuesday night. And what makes it so terrific, Mo? Well, I tell you, if you've been keeping up, you've been learning some very valuable information in regarding the book entitled The Mis-Education of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. I still say the 5th video live that I did on this here, that was a nice joint. So if you haven't went and checked out the other lives that I've done in regards to the Mis-Education of the Negro, I highly recommend that you do so. And seeing that it is a fantastic Tuesday, we're going to jump right off into this thing. Chapter 7, entitled Dissension and Weakness. And we have 10 more chapters after this, and then we'll be moving on to another book. But look out for the new uploads that I will be bringing you all, okay? What's happening here, YouTube? Okay, we're good? We're good? Okay. Now, chapter 7, Dissension and Weakness. In recent years, the church as enlightened sinners have devoted less attention to dissension than formerly. Let me cut this down for a minute. In recent years, the churches and enlightened sinners have devoted less attention to dissension than formerly. But in the rural districts and small cities, they have not changed much. And neither in urban communities nor in the country has anyone succeeded in bringing these churches together to work for the general welfare. The militant sects are still fighting one another. And in addition to this, members of these sects are contending among themselves. The Spirit of Christ cannot dwell in such an atmosphere. Now, I want you all to remind me, somebody in the chat, behind the doors in YouTube, somebody remind me of the word militant, okay? Militant. If you're out there, in fact, let me make a note of it myself. I hope I remember it. The word militant. Let's write it down here, man. Okay. I wrote militant down for a reason. Okay. Recent experiences show that these dissensions are about as rank as ever. For example, a rural community, meaning, country, for you all not familiar with rural areas that's not in the cities. Okay. For example, a rural community in which an observer spent 3 weeks a year ago has no church at all. Although 8 or 10 families live there, no church can thrive among them because, with 1 or 2 exceptions, each family represents a different denomination, and the sectarian bias is so pronounced that no one will accept the procedure of the other. Each one loves for his fellow man if he thinks as he does, but if his fellow man does not, he hates and shuns him. Which reminds me of urban areas where you have all of these churches and you have all of these mosques and you have all of these synagogues and temples, and yet black men in America, express themselves as I don't know how many things. Some Muslims, some Christians, some Hebrews, some Jews, and yet they cannot come to a common thread that they are man before they're anything, not understanding that these churches, religions, synagogues, mosques, temples, these things have actually separated them, more so bringing them together. Remember, I believe it was chapter 5. 5 was a banger. And what stuck in my mind was that in chapter 5, with this dissension that I'm talking about now, back then, men went to school to educate themselves, to prepare themselves for the upliftment of a downtrodden people. People don't do that anymore. You a Jew and I'm a Muslim, you can't really mess with me too much, even though Muslims got their religion from the Jews. So, and so forth and so forth. You know, I can't read your book because I'm a Christian and you can't read my book. No, not that you can't, but you won't read it. If I'm reading and you reading the Quran, we won't read each other books. Crazy, ludicrous. Children, ignorant children that are being taught by ignorant leaders, imams, priests, pastors, fathers. I'm just saying, even the Pope himself does what? Has a brotherhood with the Muslims. That's right, the Catholics, the Pope got fellowship with the Muslim, has fellowship with the Christians, has fellowships with all peoples around the world. Yet you, the little people, the ignorant people who can't see past the mask of the dissension and weakness, and see, I wrote militant right there so that I remember it in regards to gangs, another form of dissension. We'll get to that. Okay, at the end, I'll let you know that at the end. In another rural community where the same observer recently spent 2 weeks, he found a small and poorly attended Methodist church worshiping there one Sunday morning. He counted only 4 persons who lived in the community. Others may have come, for there was no other church for them in that place, but this particular church was not of their faith, and their numbers was too small to justify the establishment of one to their liking. The support given the unfortunate pastor there is so meager that he can hardly afford to come to them once a month, and consequently, these peasants are practically without spiritual leadership. They are without spiritual leadership. People who are directed as to develop such an attitude are handicapped for life. Someone recently inquired as to why the religious schools do not teach people how to tolerate differences of opinion and to cooperate for the common good. Then I'm telling you, hey, sad but true. And I just told you this before he said it. This, however, is the thing which these institutions have refused to do. Religious schools have been established, but they are considered necessary to supply workers for denominational outposts and to keep alive the sectarian bias by which the Baptists hope to outstrip the Methodists, or the latter the former. No teacher in one of these schools has advanced a single thought which has become a working principle for Christendom, and not one of these centers is worthy of the name of the School of Theology. Mis-Education of the Negro, 1933. And this book is a hardcover. I'll be moving around. Soft covers really don't do it, but there's another attractive, more appealing cover, which is a black woman with a headband with a lock on it, a band lock on her head. Interesting. Very eye-catching. In fact, the first time that I read this book, that's the book that I read, the one with the band on the lock with it. But this book is just as good as just a hardcover. If one could bring together all of the teachers in such schools and carefully sift them, he would not find in the whole group a sufficient number qualified to conduct one accredited school of religion. The large majority of them are engaged in importing to the youth worn out theories of the ignorant oppressor, meaning his religion. I'm just saying. This lack of qualified teachers in Negro schools of theology, however, is not altogether the fault of the teachers themselves. It is largely due to the system to which they belong. It is largely due to the system that they belong. And they need to keep your mind in the clouds so that they can continue to gather greedily everything that's down here on the earth where you have your feet planted. Yet they have you looking at the clouds and the space like you're a space cadet. That's what religion does. You ask any one of them where heaven is at. Some place that they ain't never been. Some place that ain't nobody came back and told them where they went. I'm just saying. You think about it. If we're energy and we die, fleshly, great. Has anybody came back and told me that? When the star dies, what does it do? I'm just saying. Yeah, isn't that like supernovas? I'm just saying. So its life has expired, but went out with a bang. Anyway, right. Their schools of theology are impoverished by their unnecessary multiplication, and consequently, the instructors are either poorly paid or not compensated at all. Many of them have to farm, conduct enterprises, or pastor churches to make a living while trying to teach. Often, then, only the insufficient can be retained under such circumstances. Only what? Only what? Only the insufficient, the ignorant, can be maintained under such circumstances. Isn't that the circumstances in which we are living in today? Anyway, yet those who see how they have failed because of these things nevertheless object to the unification of the churches as taught by Jesus of Nazareth, whom have all but ceased to follow because of their sectarian bias obtained from thumb-worn books of misguided Americans and Europeans. I'm going to say that again. Misguided Americans and Europeans. Recently, an observer saw a result of this in the sermon of a Negro college graduate trying to preach to a church of the masses. He referred to all of the great men in the history of a certain country to show how religious they were, whether they were or not. When he undertook to establish the Christian character of Napoleon, however, several felt like leaving the place in disgust. The climax of the service was a prayer by another miseducated Negro who devoted most of the time to thanking God for Cicero and Demosthenes. Okay. Here then was a case of the religion of the pagan handed down by the enslaver and segregationist to the Negro. Whew. Slap, slap, slap. It's a banger in here. It's a banger. Returning to the table where he had placed his offering in a church on a Sunday morning, not long thereafter, this observer saw another striking example of this failure to hit the mark. He stopped to inquire of his friend, Jim Miner, as to why he had not responded to the appeal for collection. What? Said Jim. I ain't giving that man nothing. That man ain't fed me this morning, and I ain't feeding him. This was Jim's reaction to a scholarly sermon entitled The Humiliation of the Incarnation. During this discourse, too, the minister had much to say about John Knox Orthodox, and another of the communicants bowing at the shrine inquired of the observer latter as to who this John Knox Orthodox was and where he lived. The observer could not answer all of the inquiries thus invoked, but he tried to explain the best he could that the speaker had studied history and theology. This was the effect this sermon had on an earnest congregation. The minister had attended a school of theology, but had merely memorized words and phrases. That's why you have a test, just to see what you retained. But when the spirit of the universe hits you, some people call it God, some people call her a God, but when the spirit of the universe hits you, and you put those sunglasses on that Dick Gregory spoke about, yeah, the magic sunglasses, you can't take them off. It reminds me of a proverb. The more you know, the more you increase in sorrow. Why? Because you can't do anything about it. You can't. Because you got some people want to kill you already. And they look like you. So they're not going to support you. You got the other guy in these other communities want you gone too because you're disrupting the machine. So either way, would you be the next Jesus being crucified on the cross? Will you be the next one that your Lord and Savior leave you at, like the Father God did Jesus? I'm just saying. This was the effect of the sermon he had on an earnest congregation. The minister had attended a school of theology, but had merely memorized words and phrases, which meant little to him and nothing to those who heard his discourse, meaning he didn't have no spirit, no nothing, just miseducated of the Negro. You see, the school in which he had been trained followed traditional courses for ministers, devoting most of the time to dead languages and dead issues. He had given attention to polytheism, monotheism, and the doctrine of the Trinity. He had also studied the philosophical basis of the Caucasian dogma, the elements of that theology, and the schism by which fanatics made religion a football and multiply wars only to moisten the soil of Europe with the blood of unoffending men. I hope you got that. We're not going to waste too much time on that. We know that the European history is written in bloodshed all over the map. That's not even up for debate. The minister had given no attention to the religious background of the Negroes to whom he was trying to preach. Now, speaking of, uh, the soil filled with blood of unoffending men, just takes me back to a movie that I watched a while ago, Iron Man 3. Yeah, and in that you had Tony Stark's enemy, the guy who wanted Pepper. He said that he is going to be the new name of terrorism. And he was a white dude. And I just sat there and thought about it. That history is written in bloodshed. Who wants to be a terrorist? Who wants to be a terrorist? But then again, they swapping terrorists for basketball players, so I really don't know what's going on. All right, but anyway, okay. Getting back to it. He knew nothing of their spiritual endowment and their religious experiences as it had expressed itself. He did not seem to know anything about their present situation. These honest people, therefore, knew nothing additional when he had finished his discourse. At one communicator pointed out, their wants had not been supplied, and they wondered where they might go to hear a word which had some bearing upon the lives which they had to live. Not long ago, when the author was in Virginia, he inquired about a man who was once a popular preacher in that state. He is here, they said, but he is not preaching now. He went off to school, and when he came back, the people could not understand what he was talking about. Then he began to find fault with the people because they would not come to church. He called them foggy because they did not appreciate his new style of preaching and the things he talked about. The church went down to nothing, and he finally left it and took up farming. In a rural community, then a preacher of this type must fail unless he can organize separately members of the popular Methodist and Baptist churches who go to the ritualistic churches or establish certain refined Methodist or Baptist churches catering to the talented tenth. For lack of adequate numbers, however, such churches often fail to develop sufficient force to do very much for themselves or for anybody else. On Sunday morning, then their pastors have to talk to the benches while these truncated churches, downtrodden, go higher in their own atmosphere of self-satisfaction. The mentally undeveloped are lack to sink lower because of the lack of contact with the better trained. If the latter exercise a little more judgment, they will be able to influence these people for good by gradually introducing advanced ideas. Because our highly educated people don't do this, large numbers of Negroes drift into churches led by uneducated ministers who can scarcely read and write. These preachers do not know much of what is found in school books and can hardly make use of a library in working out a sermon, but they understand the people with whom they deal with, and they make such use of the human laboratory that sometimes they become experts in solving vexing problems and meeting social needs. Hands-on experience. They would much better they would be much better preachers if they could have attended a school devoted to the development of the mind rather than to the cramming it with extraneous matters which have no bearing on the task which lies before them. Unfortunately, however, very few of such schools of religion now exist. For lack of intelligent guidance, then the Negro church often fulfills a mission in the contrary of that for which it was established, because the Negro church is a free field and is controlled largely by Negroes themselves. It seems that practically all the incompetents and undesirables who have been barred from other walks of life by race, prejudice, and economic difficulties have rushed to the ministry for their exploitation of these people. Honest ministers who are trying to do their duty then find their task made difficult by these men who stoop to practically everything conceivable. Almost anybody on the lowest type may get into the Negro ministry. The Methodists claim that they have strict regulations to prevent this, but their net draws in proportionately as many undesirables as one finds among the Baptists, meaning all of them rotten. Okay? Sad but true. Look at what's his name? The Brooklyn pastor. Mhm. You see what he did, right? Now, what's the difference between him and T.D. Jakes and Creflo Dollar? They've been out here a while and they haven't been to prison, but they're placing people in prison, a prison of the mind. Yeah, you go to church and you hear these charismatic men speak to you and it make you feel good. It make you feel good. But is it helping your life? Is it helping your pockets? Is it helping your family? Is it helping anybody around you? Is it doing any good for the drugs and the alcohol abuse in your community, or prostitution in your community, or crime in your community? Is any of that religion doing anything about that? And if it's not, that means that God is absent in your religion. I'm just saying. Now, Here it is. As evidence of the depths to which the institution has gone, a resident of Cincinnati recently reported a case of this exploitation by a railroad man who lost his job and later all his earnings in a gang in a den of vice in that city. To refinance himself, he took an old black frock, F-R-O-C-K, coat, and made a Bible and went into the heart of Tennessee, where he conducted at various points in a series of protracted meetings, which netted him 299 converts to the faith and $400 in cash. He was enabled thereby to return to the game in Cincinnati, and he is still in the lead. Other such cases are frequently reported. Did you hear that? What? Gambling. The large majority of Negro preachers of today then are doing nothing more than to keep up with the medieval hellfire scare, which the whites have long since abandoned to emphasize the humanitarian trend in religion through systematic education. The young people of the Negro race could be held in the church by some such program, but the Negro Christianity does not conceive of a social uplift as a duty of the church. So what's the purpose of it? To keep you stupid? And consequently, Negro children have not been adequately trained in religious matters to be equal to the social demands upon them. Hey, I used to live a life like that because I was raised in the church. I have 3 pastors in my family. 2 are dead and 1 is still living. All 3 of them had churches and 1 had a real big church, which I went to church every Sunday, every Saturday, sung in the choir. No, I didn't go all the way through the week. No, I didn't do all of that. But I sang in the choir for 10 years as a kid. And when I was 16, everything changed because now I'm more of an adult thinking on my own at 16. And I found a whole lot of fault and let it rip one day, you know. I ran into this young man who put me on some game, and it's been on since then with religion. In fact, every school of thought that I could think of, especially history, that has manipulated the minds of those who read it or is educated by the system and they go no further. That is a zombie, as King Goz would say. Now that is a zombie. Shouts out to King Goz. And speaking of King Goz, I want to get off into this book that I won in his book club. That would be a book that I'm going to read and share with you all. And no, I've never read it, so I don't know anything about what it's about. So maybe we'll all be surprised, okay? Turning their back on medievalism, then these untrained youth think nothing of taking up moonshining, gambling, and racketeering as occupations, as they find great joy in smoking, drinking, and fornications as diversions. They cannot accept the old ideals, and they do not understand the new. What the Negro church is, however, has been determined largely by what the white man has taught the race by precept and example. We must remember that the Negroes learned their religion from the early white Methodists and Baptists who evangelized the slaves and poor whites when they were barred from proselytizing the aristocracy. The American white people themselves taught Negroes to specialize unduly in the praise of the Lord, hallelujah worship. In the West Indies, among the Anglicans and among the Latin people, Negroes do not show such emotionalism. They are cold and conservative. Some of the American whites, moreover, are just as far behind in this respect as the Negroes are. We have had less opportunity to learn better. While in Miami, Florida, not long ago, the author found in 2 interracial holiness churches that the following was a 3rd or 4th white. The whites had joined wholeheartedly with the Negroes in their holy rolling, and some of them seemed to be rollers and not holy. A few months ago in Huntington, West Virginia, where the author was being entertained by friends, the party was disturbed throughout the evening and by most insane outbursts of white worshipers in a church of God across the street. There, They daily indulge in such whooping and screaming in unknown tongues. Yeah, I'm watching my battery, my computer is unplugged. That the Negroes had to report them to the police as a nuisance. Wow. The black people had to call the police on the white Christian people because they was just making too much noise praising Jesus. Okay. The author has made a careful study of the Negro church, but he has never known Negroes to do anything to surpass the performance of those heathen. The American Negroes' ideas of morality, too, were borrowed from their owners. The Negroes could not be expected to raise a higher standard than their aristocratic governing class that teemed with sin and vice. This corrupt state of things did not easily pass away. The Negroes have seen any striking examples among the whites to help them in the matters of religion. Even during the colonial period, the whites claimed that their ministers sent to the colonies by the Anglican Church, the progenitor of the Protestant Episcopalian Church in America, were a degenerate class that exploited the people for money to waste it in the racing horses and drinking liquor. But now they just buy Rolexes, Rolls Royces, jets, and mansions. It's all a hustle. It's all a hustle. And I'm going to tell you something else about pastors since we're talking about that. One of those, my uncles who was a pastor, used to drink right after he get the sermon. Straight up. He'll go get him a bottle and go drink. And get drunk. And get drunk. Shouts out to Uncle Real. I'm serious. I used to see this. And a lot of pastors are whoremongers. They like to sleep with a lot of women. And he used to sleep with a lot of women too. Yeah, the Baptist preacher. And if you're a man and you got a wife that's in that church, you better keep your wife away from the preacher. I don't care if he is married. I'm just saying. Yes. So we understand that you're dealing with paganism. And we went over that in the 16 Crucified Saviors. That was such a crucial book. If you haven't watched those videos, go back and check them videos out. 16 Crucified Saviors. I'm telling you, I dropped mad jewels on you all from that book and from real life experiences. The first 10 are imaging, 5-minute videos, all the way to 10. And after 10, everything else is live. Go check out those videos. In fact, just check the whole page out, okay? And press the subscribe button below. Hit the notification bell. Share the information. Press the like button. But most importantly, get the message. Get the message. Shouts out to Hassan Campbell. Although the author was born 10 years after the Civil War, the morals and religion of that regime continued even until his time. Many of the rich or well-to-do white men belonging to churches in Buckingham County, Virginia, indulged in polygamy. They raised one family by a white woman and another by a colored or poor white woman. But the owner of the largest slave